Welcome to the series of Relational Database Management System. Myself is Fatima Rafiq, Assistant Professor, Abedan Amda Senior College, PCA Department. We have already started with the concurrency control mechanism in the last lecture. We have seen starvation of lock. Today we will see what is two-phase locking protocol. In two-phase locking protocol is the locking mechanism where we are trying to control the concurrency by using this particular protocol. Here the main aim of concurrency control mechanism, here we will be doing a concurrency control by using a one variable that is called lock variable. So that's why it is called locking protocol. And now why two-phase locking protocol or 2PL? It is also called 2PL because this particular protocol is having two phases. That's why it is called two-phase locking protocol. Now what are these two phases? Number one is growing phase, number two is shrinking phase. A growing phase is a phase where a transaction can obtain a lock but it cannot release any lock. If the transaction T1 is require data item A, B, C and D. So what the transaction T1 will do, transaction T1 will occupy the lock on data item A, B, C and D. So this particular phase is called growing phase, where the transaction any particular transaction is taking a lock or obtaining a lock, but it is not able to release any of lock. Next phase is called shrinking phase. A transaction can release in this particular phase, a transaction can release a lock, but it cannot occupy or it cannot obtain any new lock. Like for example, T1 transaction again. If I say that T1 transaction is taking or it is releasing the data item A, B, C and D, which is previously locked by data transaction T1. So releasing the lock is a phase which is called shrinking phase. So initially whenever the transaction is actually executing, the transaction has to occupy or obtain all the locks. That is nothing but a growing phase. Once the transaction execute all the statement which it wants to execute, then the next phase comes which is called shrinking phase. In a shrinking phase, transaction is releasing all the lock but it cannot occupy any new lock. Initially the transaction is in the growing phase. In this it acquire all the locks which is needed. Once the transaction release a lock, it enters the shrinking phase and it can be issue no more locks. The point in the schedule where the transaction has obtained its final lock. The end of its growing phase is called lock point. If we consider transaction T1, if the transaction T1 wants 4 data item A, B, C and D, and if the D is the last lock which the transaction T1 is occupying in the growing phase, so that particular lock is called a lock point of a transaction. After the lock point of the transaction, then transaction will goes into the shrinking phase. Now see here we are having one example. Here we are having two transaction T1 and transaction T2, which is executing one by one. Here transaction T1 occupy the lock on data item B, which is an exclusive lock. Then it occupies the data item it occupy the lock on the data item A. Then it is doing unlock and unlock. So this phase where it is taking the lock here and here, it is called growing phase. And once all the statements are getting executed, it enters into the shrinking phase where the transaction is unlocking the data items. Here also, if we see transaction T2, it takes the lock on data item A, then it takes the lock on data item B, and then after completing its execution of all the statements, it is going into the shrinking phase. So that's why it is called two-phase locking protocol. Two-phase locking protocol means in the first phase it will occupy all the lock, obtain all the lock, and then in the another phase it will be releasing all type of lock. When we consider two-phase locking protocol, in the two-phase locking protocol we will be having certain variations also. These variations are depend on the type of lock the data item occur. Like it may have a regress lock, conservative lock, a strict lock. these are some variation of two-phase locking protocol. It depends on the criteria of the data item locking and releasing, that is growing and shrinking phase. We will be having a variations. So these are some variations which we will see in which we will be having in two-phase locking protocol. Number one is strict two-phase locking protocol. In this particular protocol, all the exclusive lock of a transaction must be held until the transaction commit. This prevents other transaction from reading the wrong data. When we saw the concurrency control in the last chapter, in last chapter number 3, we have seen that the exclusive lock, whenever the data item is actually updating, and at the same time if the transaction is reading the data item, it is called dirty read problem. So to avoid the dirty read problem, we will use the strict two-phase locking protocol. In this strict two-phase locking protocol, this protocol in which, because we know that there are two type of locks, shared and exclusive, all the shared lock we will release, but all the exclusive lock will be held until the transaction commits. Once the transaction is committed, we will release all the exclusive lock. So what it will do, it will prevent the other transaction from reading the wrong data item. Which means we can say that it is avoiding the problem of dirty read. Next is called rigorous two-phase locking protocol. Rigorous two-phase locking protocol requires all the lock, whether it is a shared or exclusive, to be held until the transaction commits. In the strict two-phase locking protocol, what we are saying, in a growing phase, transaction occupy all type of lock, but in the shrinking phase, it only releases the shared lock but not exclusive. But in the rigorous two-phase locking protocol, what it is doing, the transaction is occupying all type of lock in the growing phase, whether it is a shared lock or exclusive lock, but it does not release any of the lock until the transaction commits, whether it is a shared lock, whether it is a exclusive lock. Now the third variation of two-phase locking protocol is conservative or static two-phase locking protocol. It requires transaction to lock all the data item. It exists before the transaction begin its execution. See, sometimes what happen when the transaction is executing, transaction may acquire some of the data item, but it require some more data item which is used by some another transaction. So the transaction has to wait for the another transaction to release the data item which it wants. But at that time there may be a situation of deadlock, because that transaction, the transaction is waiting for some another transaction. Maybe that transaction is waiting some another transaction. So to avoid the situation, we will come up with the another type of two-phase locking protocol variation, which is called conservative or static two-phase locking protocol. This particular protocol says that the transaction will never start. It will only start when it occupy all the type of lock, whether it is a shared or exclusive. If any of data item can't be locked, the transaction doesn't lock any item. So what it is, like for example, if I had transaction T1 which require A, B, C and D, and let's say it obtain the lock on A, B and C, but D is used by some another transaction. So the transaction will not start its execution itself until when the D is available. If all the data, 4 data items is available, then only the transaction will start its execution. It will until all data items are available for locking. So that's why we say that conservative two-phase locking protocol is deadlock free. Why deadlock free? Because it does not have to wait for another transaction. If all the data item is available, then only it starts its execution. Once it starts its execution, after completing the execution, it will release all the type of lock, whether it is a shared or exclusive. So these are two-phase locking protocol and its variation. I hope this is clear to you. If you find any difficulty or any doubt, write in the comment box. Thank you.